Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. My name is Laura González, and today I want to share some reflections regarding what could constitute a concept of the political from an ancestral perspective. So I'm going to discuss some parameters about the difference, first between the political and politics, to start this reflective proposal. So in the first place, it is important to recognize that the political is constituted as a kind of field in which there is a defined capital, just as Pierre Bourdieu has proposed. And on the other hand, we have politics, which politics itself is the praxis derived from this conception, or from those capitals that are at play around the political. The conception of the political that we currently have, above all, well, we could say almost on a global level, has a lot to do with a power structure that has been established gradually here in Latin America, which is where I'm speaking from, especially or particularly from the case of Ecuador, following the European arrival over 500 years ago. That is in the process of establishing what Aníbal Quijano has defined as the coloniality of power. This coloniality of power has been progressively configuring an institutionality and a conception of the political that is anthropocentric in origin. So the political is being reduced to a matter that is anthropocentric. This anthropocentric conception, what it does is spread a conception of life in which the human being is the center of everything and is like the only being from which life can be observed. Based on this gaze from this human perspective, one begins to understand what is considered important for life. That is why this constitutes an order that is anthropocentric. This also results from what I have been describing in other works as the Western matrix for existence. We can speak of a Western matrix for existence to the extent that this coloniality of power, what it has taught us, is to understand life, is to relate to each other with everything we see around us and with everything that happens also within our own selves from a single way. We speak of a matrix because Europe, as it has been changing geographically with its different divisions and all, in some way has managed to consolidate an institutionality, and that has repercussions in all areas of the economy, of politics, of the state, which has shaped our way of understanding life. This is why, almost on a global level, we follow a destiny that almost passes through the same institutions. While we are small, progressively we are inserted into standardized schooling spaces. We are acquiring those tools, conceptual ones, generally coming from UNESCO, and we understand life from a perspective that is generally governed by the scientific method. So all these elements have shaped a way of seeing life that not only implies a relationship, not only conditions us to have a relationship with animals, with the stars, with everything we see around us, but deep down what it implies is that it is directing us to a certain way of existing. That is why we speak of the matrix, Western for existence, Western for obvious reasons, because it comes from a configuration process of Europe versus the rest versus the East. Although we know there are discussions of East versus West, or the East, or whatever it is called, we know that at some point that was the basis for consolidating, at least in the social imaginary, a worldwide expansion process that Aníbal Quijano has described as the coloniality of power. Furthermore, in this power structure that has been taking shape, the conception of the political that has been limited to a question or an anthropocentric matrix has been emerging, or an order has been taking shape, that an order at the political level that Rita Segato has described as the hijacking of politics. What is the hijacking of politics? The hijacking of politics is the reduction of life, or of those discussions that are considered relevant to life, generally within the framework of the state, progressively, as has been analyzed by many authors like Silvia Federici as well, the state has gradually been appropriating all aspects that are considered important for life, for the reproduction of life, for the maintenance of life in every way, and in all the spheres that have existed, and has therefore established what is relevant for life. Generally, this conception of the elements, of the parameters that are relevant for life, are limited to material aspects. What do we mean by material aspects? Or should be occupied. We are not going into a qualitative discussion of what a state is doing, no, but at least of the function or the imaginary held about the obligations of this political institution that today is governing in some way our perspective of understanding life. So we have, for example, the case of food, of health, of education, which formerly they were fields that were interconnected with each other. For our ancestors, it wasn't possible to think about nutrition without understanding that it was linked to caring for the body, understanding that it was woven together and that it constitutes currently a division, or that it currently constitutes a division between economics and health. Then this in turn, the learning or understanding of how to produce these foods, how to sow, how to harvest, was a process of learning that was understood as education, because education in a sense, the super broad field must be understood as the acquisition of certain tools or certain techniques, certain concepts, certain ideas. That is a lot of parameters or a set of elements that allow us to reproduce life in certain contexts. So what used to be could be a weave. Well, today it's seen as reduced, or it's seen as limited to an aspect fragmented from life, nutrition on one hand, health on another, education on another. And this is what we see as a nature material. These elements are observed only from one perspective, that is the production of food. The trend at a global level is to observe it simply as the possibility of satisfying a need vital to the human being. The drinking of water has the same reason for being. However, for our ancestors, the relationship with food, with water, with all the production, the sowing, the harvest, and all it implies had a much deeper relationship that had to do with a much larger environment of existence, which we currently know as nature, but we, within the proposal of the La Ceiba Millenaria, have defined it as the whole. And so nature itself, which sometimes encompasses from the cliche part of the natural, the green, the water, can be understood from a broader perspective. This is the whole, in which are involved both the material aspects, but also the immaterial aspects of our entire environment. So it's a proposal to understand what happens to us, what is in our environment from a more integral perspective. Why? Because it's important to understand how life has been gradually reduced to a perspective material in this process of the coloniality of power, and therefore to extend the conception of the political to a much larger and much more complex or encompassing scope. Well, it's necessary to consider the immaterial nature of all these elements that are in our environment, and that of course have to do with our interior as well. Now then, these historical conditions, so these conditions, social ones through which we are passing, can be represented in this square that I've drawn for you here. It's a square that precisely has to do with the square way in which we are understanding things. That has a lot to do with the search for the limits of the configuration of concepts understood as closed spaces where there is no possibility of interweaving life among the different elements I mentioned. And well, it has to do, of course, with the construction of a scientific method that has progressively established in us a way of understanding the whole, a way of understanding characterized by being anthropocentric, by understanding only those aspects that are objective, those that are verifiable, which in one way or another are limited to the scientific method. Parameters that can be proven, parameters or elements that in some way or another demonstrate the construction of a truth. Because in this process of shaping the political there is a huge need to build structures in which individual existence has no major relevance. This can also be represented through the double spiral. I'll share that what I found in my doctoral thesis, in which I conducted an analysis of the institutionalization process of cultural heritage and intangible heritage in Ecuador, was a process of externalizing life. That is to say, every time that we talk about, that we name heritage-related matters, every time we try to get a community to connect to what the UNESCO has defined as cultural heritage, intangible, a kind of externalization of life is achieved. That is what exists locally, what has validity and legitimacy for the people who are involved in that manifestation. It acquires relevance or is placed in the larger context of existence. So this is what I call a process of externalizing life, and that for our grandparents, so for many ancestors, as it has been defined in many places, has to do with the process of institutionalization or the process of manifestation of an energy of a masculine nature, which is an energy that goes outward. So we have the masculine on one side and the feminine on the other, which of course, this implies a process of internalization. The proposal of the spiral or the double spiral is something I've been working on as a commitment to understand what happens to us as human beings from an ontological level and from elements ontological that can be considered elements of an ancestral nature that have been present in these lands, that have been present in the land of Manabi, which is where I belong on the Ecuadorian coast. But they've been present in many places in the world. What they're basically telling us is that there is a dual force that doesn't have the nature hierarchical or that hierarchical division and binary that is established in the Western world of the masculine over the feminine, of man over woman, over nature and versus human being, but rather they are actually two forces that have a sense of orientation, different but complementary. So what we can understand here is that there's a continuity of life. So if we manage to capture this concept of the double spiral and the meaning or this proposal of continuity to this conception of the political, what we have is an expansion of life and of those parameters that should be considered relevant to life. What am I referring to? That if, for example, we have this square that has limited us to understanding everything from the material issue, well, we can expand life towards other planes that go far beyond this issue that we are seeing within this coloniality of power and within this Western matrix for existence, ways of understanding, of relating to the whole that I mentioned, that are not anthropocentric, that break with this nature and that go much further. What is here, for example, there is, for example, language or the possibility of communicating with water, with the mountains, with the birds, of communicating with the spirits, with the ancestors. This, of course, has tons of implications. This implies, for example, the need to accept, not necessarily to construct, because it's something that's already present in many populations in the world, but rather to accept the construction of another type of language that goes far beyond the scientific method, that poses the need to have something observable, something materializable with which we can relate the construction of or a way of understanding life that has led, for example, to us understanding animals simply as beings that are within an evolutionary scale and that are within some type of classification, whether mammals, whether reptiles, whether any of those things in which we usually are immersed in the educational system. But we lose the possibility of understanding existence, much more than that of understanding other planes of communication with these other beings that also form part of the whole. So I consider that a proposal of the political has to break with an anthropocentric conception of life, and it has to allow us to expand, to understand these other dimensions of reality. that for many peoples in the world currently, especially indigenous populations, and for many peoples in the past, they were part of reality. Because if on the one hand we have material issues that are fundamental to resolve our human subsistence, food, health, education, all the aspects that are necessary, we've also lost the possibility of understanding that these same dimensions, these same factors of our life can be observed from this set of relationships that are of another nature, in another field of the immaterial. So this is when we can remember that the whole is the sum of material aspects and the immaterial aspects, and how we transcend this. Well, this has a lot to do with the Congress that brings us together today, as I believe that the way to break or to return to a form of existence that transcends the anthropocentric parameters that are generating tons of problems, including the great climate crisis we are living through, is through the recovery of sacredness. The sacred must be understood as the possibility of building bonds or establishing a relationship between these other levels of reality that are not necessarily perceptible, that are not necessarily palpable, but that are fundamental for human existence. Because following this principle of duality, we cannot stay solely with material matters if we don't also see the immaterial matters, which, by the way, the material and the immaterial have nothing to do or don't coincide with masculine and feminine. By the way, these are other spheres of human existence, but they can also be understood in the same dimension of the double spiral. We cannot stay solely in this dimension because this creates an imbalance in the other direction. And that is also important. Regarding the issue or a conception of politics in an ancestral key, besides breaking with anthropocentric parameters, it's necessary to define new parameters about what we want to be as humanity. While we know that at a global level, there are the goals of the new millennium that periodically change names, which are understood as those parameters we must seek as humanity. I believe that to understand a proposal for politics in an ancestral key, it is necessary to redefine the parameters of what we seek and move from this search that is limited to material matters toward another more anchored to these other immaterial aspects that are fundamental for human existence. And this has to do with the search for balance. Yes, we need to nourish ourselves, we need to drink water, but we need that food and the water we drink to nourish other parts of our body so that community ties are not destroyed, so that people don't look for meaning in life in drugs, or look for ways to take their own life, or look for ways to end life in different ways, harming themselves and others. I'm not necessarily saying that there's a direct cause and effect between the reduction of life in this regard and all the problems that we are indeed facing today. But it is evident that there are many crises through which we are passing, which are telling us that we have a relationship limited with our entire environment that is turning into a crisis, a climate one that is finally limiting all the possibilities of life for future generations. So this proposal of the political in an ancestral key arises from this reflection on how we could reflect on an ontological level to transcend all these limitations that currently we face and that limit the conception of the political in all these keys I mentioned, and the anthropocentric based on the Western matrix of existence. Finally, I must reflect on why the political, why not talk about, human development, human evolution? Because the political has been institutionalized as that field where what is important for life is defined, where it is discussed and where it exists, and where all institutional efforts are channeled to achieve a way of being for humanity. So I consider it to be the same field where we can integrate all these elements, all these reflections that go beyond the issue of anthropocentrism that has been imposed on these lands, to bring up or propose new ways of understanding life. Thank you very much.